There's that old saying, isn't there, that rules are rules, but sometimes the rules are more guidelines. Because while the FIA has its own set of rules that all the teams have to obey, some of the suppliers into Formula One have their own little guidelines that might overrule what the FIA says. Now stick with me here because this is quite an interesting story. There are suppliers from all sorts of companies involved in the sport. Brakes, electronics, spark plugs, fuel and other bits and pieces that are put onto the cars that the teams design and build, and then they race those cars every other weekend, or every weekend it seems these days. And the amount of races in a season these days has attracted its own concerns and controversies, but at the end of it all, the teams are looking to improve performance wherever they can. And the teams have worked in conjunction with the things that these suppliers have, supplied a few times over the years. The first notable instance of this is Jos Verstappen, whose Benetton was engulfed in flames at the 1994 German Grand Prix, the result of an alleged attempt at cheating by Benetton, as it had appeared that a foreign object had become stuck in the fuel filling hose after Benetton had removed the filter from the fuel line. This in turn had fueled, no pun intended, the theory that Benetton had been fiddling with the fuel rig since the very beginning of the season, as seen when Schumacher entered the pit lane in Brazil behind Senna but managed to get out ahead of him, to the tune of I think it was like a 2-second swing, something like that. Removing the filter supposedly improved the fuel flow by 12.5%, but later investigation concluded that several teams, not just Benetton, had been told to remove this filter by the manufacturer, Intertechnique. Just before the FIA closed the matter, LaRousse had mentioned that they had been told to remove this filter because of problems with the fuel rigs that Jordan and Lotus had encountered, and this all went towards Benetton escaping punishment. The second case study here is a tyre test conducted by Pirelli after the 2013 Spanish Grand Prix. While Mercedes and Pirelli maintained they'd got permission from the FIA to do this, protests filed by Red Bull and Ferrari made the FIA look into the matter, and despite the other teams refusing to pile on Mercedes, they still wanted clarification on all this too, because why were only Mercedes invited and how much data did they gain from it? Despite Pirelli writing to the teams saying that if the need arose, they would call on the teams to do a test, given that, Pirelli is the tyre supply for the series and would later experience blowouts at the British Grand Prix a couple of months down the line, the rules on the matter were very clear. In-season testing is heavily restricted, and if the teams want to do bits and pieces on a track, they have to use an older car. Mercedes used the 2013 car, and Pirelli was doing it on the down low to avoid a political carnage fest afterwards, because teams would be wondering why somebody else should get the tyre data, and they didn't. Pirelli had chosen Mercedes because Mercedes were harder on their tyres than everybody else on the grid, and Hamilton had experienced a failure already that season in Bahrain. Mercedes at the time was experiencing peak temperatures in their tyres some 20 degrees hotter than the other teams, and those tyres used at that Barcelona test were a spec that Pirelli wanted to bring in for the Canadian Grand Prix. What people seem to forget about all of this is Pirelli had asked Ferrari to do a test as well. Ferrari didn't know about Mercedes testing and vice versa, but Ferrari had run their test in 2013 with a 2011 car. Mercedes used the current one. Mercedes' argument was, we need to use the current car to replicate the conditions that resulted in the Bahrain tyre failure, but in the end, the FIA decided to exclude Mercedes from a young driver test after Silverstone. Not that Mercedes gained anything from it. After the British Grand Prix failures, Pirelli reverted to an older spec of tyre that suited Red Bull better, and Vettel dominated the second half of the season. 2 years later though, at the Italian Grand Prix, Mercedes would be involved in another controversy involving Pirelli tyres. 2015 was the second of the 3 seasons that Mercedes absolutely blitzed. By the time the Italian Grand Prix rolled around, Hamilton and Rosberg had won all but 2 races that year, with Vettel taking the honours for Ferrari at Malaysia, only his second race for the team, and at Hungary, the first race in Formula One after the passing of Jules Bianchi. Hamilton had been on pole for every race except for one, the Spanish Grand Prix, but it was Lewis that was destroying everybody, as he had 6 wins to Rosberg's 3, with Vettel just 1 win behind Nico, in a car that was a marked improvement on the previous Ferrari, but still not great. By the Spanish Grand Prix, Hamilton had scored 93 points out of a possible 100. It was going to be a case of Mercedes and Hamilton steamrolling their way to another title. Although Hamilton's lead was cut from 27 points to just 10 within 2 races. Rosberg won the Spanish Grand Prix from Hamilton, but at Monaco, Hamilton was pitted under the virtual safety car while Rosberg and Vettel didn't pit, and Hamilton was narrowly passed on the pit exit. As a result, Rosberg won from Vettel with Hamilton third, but Hamilton pulled a gap back out with wins in Canada and Silverstone before Mercedes had their second poor Hungarian Grand Prix in a row, where Vettel took the top spot from Kvyat and Ricciardo. Hamilton and Rosberg once again finished 1-2 in Belgium. Vettel in the Ferrari should have been third, but it ended up being Grosjean that was third because Vettel had suffered a blowout. With just 2 laps left on the board, Vettel suffered a horrific blowout while going through the Eau Rouge Raidillon section of the track, spraying rubber absolutely everywhere. On the Friday of that same weekend, Rosberg had suffered a blowout at 190 miles an hour, while Vettel was lucky that his tyre had gone while coming out of Eau Rouge as opposed to going into that section. I mean, the blowout happened at the top of the hill at Raidillon, but I'm not here to be specific, I'm just calling it Eau Rouge because that's what everybody calls it. Vettel was also 28 laps into a one-stop strategy that should have paid off for him, but the tyre blew with about 8 miles left to run. After the incident, Vettel was absolutely livid with what had happened. If that accident had happened 200 metres further back, he would have probably ended up in a tyre wall in one of the biggest shunts you've ever seen. Emotions were still running high at this point because 3 or 4 weeks prior to the Belgian Grand Prix, the drivers had been at a funeral for another driver. Maybe I need to do a compilation of Pirelli's greatest hits, simply because the criticism of what they've received over the last, nearly 15 years has piled up, and we can look at what's happened where in terms of their construction. It might be interesting. It might be one for soon, TM. But not long after Vettel's criticisms went out across the internet, including to outlets like The Guardian as well as the usual motorsport outlets, Pirelli asked Bernie to tell the drivers to not publicly shame the tyres and air any issues in private with Paul Hembury and the team. So following all of this, people were a little bit on edge. So for the Italian Grand Prix of 2015, the state of play was as follows. Hamilton now led the standings from Rosberg by nearly 30 points. 227 plays 199, with Vettel not that far back from Nico in third on 160. Behind those two, it was Raikkonen and Massa tied on 82, with Bottas on 70. The two Red Bulls not even at the 60-point mark yet. The only two non-scorers of the season, unsurprisingly, were Will Stevens and Roberto Merri in the Manners, who were running, for all intents and purposes, a 2014 chassis and engine because of their money woes. Pirelli, meanwhile, decided to change up the tyre choices for that weekend. Instead of going for the harder compounds for this round, they decided to bring the mediums and the softs, as opposed to the mediums and the hards that they'd used before, in 2014 that is. Sauber were quite happy with this choice, as it would mean the drivers would have to be a little more careful in the corners to keep the times up over a stint, as opposed to just, hammering harder tyres lap after lap, knowing that the wear wouldn't be that bad. At the same time, bringing softer tyres that wear faster would maybe force the teams into an extra stop and not chancing it like Vettel had done at Spa. And despite dominating the season, Mercedes was not screwing around. While Ferrari put 3 of their development tokens into the engine for the Italian Grand Prix, Mercedes dumped all 7 remaining tokens in. That said, Renault still had 12 available to use and Honda had 4, with Ferrari now also having 4, having spent 3 of their remaining 7, if you follow me. This being when Mercedes could afford to take the piss with things. But it didn't exactly go to plan for Mercedes. Rosberg had to revert to the engine that he'd used at the Belgian Grand Prix because the brand new engine he had for Monza had encountered issues. So he was going to be running at Monza, the power circuit, on an engine that had done 6 races by this point, while Hamilton had a brand new engine with more power. This was the thing back then, shorter seasons and you could use 4 engine components a season. Yes, you can use 4 now, but it used to be 3, but with the season getting longer it was pushed back up to 4. But with a 19-race season back then, you still had a bit more freedom to swap things around, even if a couple of teams, namely McLaren and Red Bull, were burning through engine components like it was still 1996. Typically, you'd have your first engine at the start of the season, obviously, and then assuming it all went well, you'd bring an upgraded one for Canada, because that's got a long straight that you need to take advantage of. You bring your third one for Monza because, again, power, and then run that to the end, and then you've got a free one if you need it. Or maybe change it again at Mexico or Brazil that you can use as a test bench for the following season. But with Rosberg on a 6-race old engine and Hamilton's brand new, the race was essentially Lewis's for the taking. Rosberg's old engine had clearly hampered him. He was just 4th on the grid, 4 tenths off Hamilton with the 2 Ferraris splitting them, the Tifosi getting their hopes up for potentially the 2 Scarlet cars getting in front of Hamilton at some point, and maybe winning the race with their new specification engines, knowing that already Rosberg was going to be a little down on power. The rest of the top 10 was Massa, Bottas, Perez, Grosjean, Hülkenberg and Ericsson. McLaren, Red Bull and Toro Rosso were all going to be copping penalties for this particular race, and it didn't help matters that when Max Verstappen went out to do his qualifying run in the first qualifying session, his engine cover flew off as he went through Curva Grande. Then he got a drive-through penalty that he'd have to serve in the race because of an unsafe release. The engine penalties for this race were as much of a joke now as we all thought they were at the time. No, really, have a look at this. Ericsson's 10th became 12th because he got a penalty for impeding in qualifying, standard stuff, but Sainz got a 35 place penalty for sorting out his engine issues, as did Kvyat. Verstappen was given 30 for engine changes and was outside of the 107% time because he never set a lap, so started from plumb last. Ricciardo was given 50 places. 50 for his engine component changes, while Alonso was given 10, which is a minimal penalty for McLaren at that point, and Button was given 5. But the hilarious thing is, Button and Alonso actually started one position forward from their qualifying positions because the Red Bulls and the Toro Rossos were basically starting the race in Hungary. The Tifosi's hopes were dashed right at the beginning of the Grand Prix. When the lights went out, everybody got off the line, except Raikkonen. Well, he did eventually get running, but not after the other 19 cars had overtaken him. Raikkonen's issue hurt Rosberg most. As Nico avoided Kimi, Massa and Bottas slipped through, with the two Lotuses not making the end of the second lap because Grosjean had taken collision damage and Maldonado had damaged his chassis as he went over the curbs. Kimi meanwhile charged back up the field, making his way from last to 12th by the end of lap 3. Hamilton broke the DRS window while Rosberg was then told to cool his brakes because he was struggling to pass Bottas. Hamilton slowly built up his lead, pulling it to around 8 seconds by lap 14. The same lap that Rosberg finally cleared Valtteri. Rosberg undercut Massa and then overtook Raikkonen, who had still yet to pit. Due to Vettel hitting traffic, Rosberg closed into around 4 seconds, but his engine gave up on lap 50. On lap 49, Hamilton received a message from Bonno saying, "Strat mode 3, we need to pull a gap. Don't ask questions, just execute." Followed by, "We need good lap times, we'll explain at the end." Hamilton simply said, "I can't go much quicker," but Bonno told him, "What you're doing is great, Lewis." Mercedes had noticed that something was not right with the car. Well, rather the FIA had noticed that something wasn't right with the car. Mercedes had been made aware of a notification from the FIA with a timestamp of 3:04 PM that the pre-race checks had flagged an issue with Hamilton's tyre pressures. Well, pressure, singular. If things went by FIA procedure, Hamilton could be hit with a 25-second penalty, and this all came about because of changes driven by what had happened at Spa. Pirelli wanted the teams to turn the pressures up, basically. Which seems a bit flat, because in my car it wants 39 psi all round because Michelin primacy for low rolling resistance reasons, but all in, these were a total of 1 psi increases all round to help lessen the risk of another blowout. Pirelli had sent out memos to every single team highlighting the importance of doing this and implored them to respect these guidelines. The memo, which was obtained by motorsport.com, said, "Our prescriptions about minimum starting pressures are based on the assumption that running pressures are higher than starting ones. These are the historical values we've seen, and we therefore need you to respect this in order to operate the tyres safely. If we find during any session that your stabilised pressures are equal to or lower than the starting pressures, we will give a higher starting pressure limit to your team, as agreed with the FIA." Pirelli was certain that one or two teams, if not all of the teams, were going to try and get clever with all of this, like having the tyres in their blankets when Pirelli took the pressures, and then just gently let some of the air out once they were on the grid and ready to go for the formation lap. So to assist Pirelli with all of this, the FIA decided to do a surprise inspection. The teams will use old tyres for the recon lap that gets them onto the grid, with the actual race tyres being kept nice and toasty in blankets ready to go on the car for the race start. That way, if you have an incident like Verstappen did a few years back where he crashed on the way to the grid in Hungary, those tyres aren't going to get unnecessarily worn through a spin or a lockup or just general driving around. They're kept until the formation lap when they're actually needed. To make sure the teams weren't going to try and get clever, Joe Bauer, the FIA's technical delegate, went out and checked the left rear tyres of the top 4 cars: Hamilton, Raikkonen, Vettel and Rosberg. Hamilton was 0.3 below the minimum. Rosberg was 1.1 below the minimum. Why the left rear? It might have just been a time thing. Checking 16 tyres in a surprise check just 3 minutes before the formation lap just isn't feasible. But it turns out Mercedes had managed to outsmart the FIA, intentionally or not. Bauer took all this information to the stewards, but the critical part of all of this is that Bauer took the measurements when the tyre blankets had been disconnected from their power source, so the tyres had started to cool down a little bit. In the time that it had taken for the FIA to check the tyres, the pressures had dropped as the tyres cooled. Long story short is that while the tyres were cool at the side of the track, the pressure wasn't legal, but when the cars were going around the track, they were legal. My tyre pressure monitoring system on my car will say 39 psi while the car sat outside. It's like 12 degrees out there right now, but if I drive around a bit, I can get those pressures up to 40 or 41 just by driving around and generating heat in the tyres, although not to the same extremes that a Formula 1 car would. And confusion between Bauer and Pirelli didn't help matters. When Pirelli took their measurements, the tyres were in their blankets, and the FIA didn't know this. Pirelli was taking hot pressures while the FIA was taking cold pressures, because Pirelli saw the pressures in the blankets as being indicative of how the tyres would be while they're out on the track. The FIA thought that cold pressures should be the one taken. But because Pirelli was accepting the pressures given to them while the tyres were hot, the FIA had to go with Pirelli's recommendations and say, okay, Mercedes, Lewis, there's going to be no more investigation into this, you're in the clear. But the final result is on your screen. Hamilton leading home from Vettel and Massa, with Bottas, Raikkonen, Perez, Hülkenberg, Ricciardo, Ericsson and Kvyat completing the top 10. 4 retirements as the 2 Lotuses retired with their damage, Alonso losing power and Rosberg also having a problem with his old engine. But with a Ferrari on the podium in a season dominated by Mercedes, the Tifosi seemed happy enough. But Hamilton was quizzed by journalists about his tyre pressure issue, with Vettel stepping in to defend him, saying that it's not Hamilton's job to know about the pressures and that he's just there to drive the car. It's the engineers that handle all of that. And it wouldn't be the first time Vettel would do this, as he also stepped in to defend Lewis calling Max a dickhead in the cool-down room after a race in Bahrain. The famous, if you stick a microphone in front of a football player, will everything that comes out of his mouth be a nice word speech. I loved Seb's redemption arc. Due to the win, Lewis's lead was now 53 points. Vettel closed his gap on Rosberg to 21 points. Massa and Raikkonen still had to break the 100-point barrier, with Lewis and the 2 Germans being far and away the best 3 of that particular season. For some extra stats, it was Hamilton's 40th win in his 50th race for Mercedes. He tied Vettel for the record of the most consecutive points finishes, overtaken Senna on the all-time list for podiums, and he got his second Grand Chelem. Or Grand Slam, whichever you want to call it. It was also Massa's last ever podium, and Vettel overtook Alonso in total career points. While Mercedes and the FIA were happy with the way things went, some other teams were not. Ferrari protested, as did Williams, but since throughout the whole race Hamilton's pressures remained above the minimum limits set by Pirelli, the FIA had to accept that things were fine. In a dominant season for Hamilton and for Mercedes, losing 25 points wouldn't have been a big deal. It would have been F1's first disqualification of a winner in 11 years, and it took another 9 years for it to happen for real. While it wouldn't have affected the 2015 championship, it might have affected others if the precedent had been set. And also, one thing to consider here is that Hamilton managed to get a 25-second gap between him and Vettel towards the end of the Grand Prix. Just. But as it was, Mercedes got away with it, if you want to call it that, all because they obeyed the laws of thermodynamics. I mean, probably I just wanted to drop a Simpsons reference right in at the end there. So then, a look at how Mercedes escaped punishment at the 2015 Italian Grand Prix. If this has been a fun, interesting and entertaining look back through the motorsport history books, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks, as ever, go out to the fine folk at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help support me at a more personal level, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates, and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there if you just want to buy me a coffee, and memberships if you want to support but don't want to do it through Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.